All right, let's conclude by just talking a little bit about two other sort of potential ethical issues that might arise for the mortician or the funeral director. These types of issues. I mean, we think a lot about ethical concerns that might come up in really obvious professions. We have courses with names like medical ethics, business ethics, environmental ethics. But we don't have a course called, mortician ethics, mortuary science ethics. And I think there's maybe not as much awareness as there probably should be, especially for individuals who are entering into this field. And I imagine there may be one or two of you in this course. There usually are. I think there's not as much of a sense that this is a profession that deals with ethical issues and ethical questions, quite nearly as much as there's that sort of sense in medicine or business or something like that. And what we're going to do is conclude with just a couple of potential ethical issues and questions that might come up for the mortician or the funeral director. And the first one, which you read a little bit about, was concerned whether when a mortician or funeral director is presenting options to the family of the deceased, whether they should describe the cremation process in any kind of detail. Because the family has to give consent for the process. And, in medicine, when we ask for informed consent, we really want the patient to understand, many of the specific details of the procedure, because we want them to understand, how they're going to feel when it's over, what their recovery time is going to be like, whether there's going to be scarring, things like that. And you might think that consent for the cremation process should be similarly detailed with regard to the specifics of the process. Morticians are mixed about this. You might think the answer is no, that this is unnecessarily gruesome, that it's just kind of, disgusting. The process is actually pretty intense when you talk about the level of heat that's required to incinerate bone. And then there is a process of pulverizing the remains so that you end up with that sort of fine powder and not just sort of chunks of charred bone. It's a little gory when you're talking about, your beloved Aunt Edith and her bones being sort of pulverized. You might think that it also puts undue stress on the family. It sort of asks them to consider something pretty problematic. Another reason you might think that this description shouldn't be part of the consent process is just when you compare it to something like embalming, right? We don't currently require a detailed description of the embalming process in order to obtain consent for embalming. So we might, by describing the cremation process in detail, end up either inadvertently or deliberately, if we want to discourage cremation, influence the family of the deceased to opt for embalming, and that's a more expensive procedure. So there's a worry that if we require this, it's going to seem self-interested on the part of the mortician and funeral director, because describing the cremation process but not the embalming process makes the cremation process seem kind of gross and unappealing, and embalming then suddenly seems like this better option just because you don't know all the gory details of what's happening to great Aunt Edith. And on the one way of putting this is that, look, we don't want to inadvertently influence the family to choose anything other than what they really want. The last thing we want is the family to come back and be like, I did not want embalming. I really wanted cremation. It's only because you described it and it was so gross sounding that I opted for embalming, and you really did me a disservice. I mean, funeral directors and morticians really want to serve the family's needs well. Not only, for their own long-term self-interest, but also because, oftentimes morticians and funeral directors take their role as a service provider very seriously. They really do want to meet those needs. And, the sort of more insidious concern is that in requiring this description of the cremation process, we might end up seeming like we're trying to manipulate people into opting for embalming so that we can make more money. But there's another side to this, one that you might not have thought about if you hadn't maybe taken this course, for example. Someone might argue that, look, there are a bunch of really important considerations that both the family and the mortician have to be aware of when cremation is opted for. For example, the mortician needs to know whether there are pacemakers or other medical devices present in the remains, because those things explode during the cremation process, and so that those need to be removed. So the mortician needs to be specific about what is going to happen so that the family can inform them of that sort of thing. Families also often don't realize that it is impossible to recover 100% of the remains. It's just a consequence of the process. You can't get every last bit of Aunt Edith, and that sometimes bothers people when they find out that the remains that they have at home is not the entirety of the remains. People sometimes don't realize that the remains are going to be pulverized, that they're not just sort of cooked to a fine powder, they're actually crushed to that powder. It's also important to be aware that certain kinds of valuables that are left with the body often cannot be recovered, so, it may be very touching to leave Aunt Edith's wedding ring on her, but you gotta know that if you're going with the cremation process, you're not getting that item back. It's not going to be possible. These are the sort of things that people don't always realize when they opt for cremation, and this is the source of not only lawsuits but just complaints and dissatisfaction for the family. And so if what the mortician really cares about is meeting the family's needs, then they really do need to describe this process in detail, because that's actually part of meeting those needs effectively. Okay, so that's one kind of potential ethical issue that might come up for the practicing mortician or funeral director. Here's a case suggesting another one. Suppose that your cemetery is running a veterans special for Memorial Day with free plots for veterans and half price for spouses. Now suppose that you also have a sales quota where by the end of the month you have to have certain sales numbers, but so far you haven't really sold much. And the total cost for a free veteran plot and half price spouse, including the opening, closing, monuments, etc., is about $4,000. So it's a special, but it's not free. And suppose that a couple comes in, Mr. and Mrs. Z. They arrive at your cemetery to ask about this special. They want to make sort of pre-arrangements. Their children can't really help them, and they're really intimidated by the cost of this, even though, despite this sort of buy one get one free, one half price deal. And suppose that there is a VA cemetery that isn't as close as yours to the Z's home, but that will give burial space and markers free to both of them. So basically saving them this $4,000 at the cost of not being as close as they might like. Now the question that's posed in the reading, and that I think is worth sort of concluding our discussion about, is whether the mortician has any obligation to tell this couple this VA cemetery. Here's what morticians have to say about this. One mortician was interviewed, and several have sort of echoed this, that yes, the mortician should say this, because honesty is just sort of a core virtue of this job. So long as you're an honest, above-the-board funeral director, the business will take care of itself. What people really want and what you really owe them is just honesty, being completely upfront about things. Don't sort of concern yourself with these self-interested worries, right? Let the business end handle itself. Others have offered a more sort of metered response and said, yeah, you should mention this. When you're having a discussion about available options, one thing you should talk about is there is this VA cemetery. But it's perfectly acceptable to raise this and ask the question of whether this is really the couple's best option, given how far away it is. It may be really important to them that they are, close, not only when one of them dies and the other's still alive, but also once they're both gone and their children might want to come visit them. So this sort of middle, kind of moderate view is, yeah, it's fine. You should tell them about the VA cemetery. It's part of your job is to be totally honest and upfront. But it's fine to sort of cast it in perfectly frank terms where you really push this issue of whether or not this is really their best option. And if it is, then, you've done your job because you're trying to meet their needs and provide them a service. And if you get them where they really want to be and where they can afford to be, you should do it. So that's what morticians have to say about this. In the reading, it was pretty, these were kind of the two responses. I don't know if you sort of picked up on this, but it was either, yeah, just tell them and don't sweat it. Let the business handle itself, because this is just a core of our job, is being honest. And then this more sort of moderate view that, yeah, you should bring it up, but you don't have to sort of encourage them to go pursue it. You can ask real challenging questions about whether or not this is their best choice. I want to just leave you with an alternative, because there's something really interesting about the role of the mortician and funeral director, which is that we've heard a lot about how their sort of first duties are to sort of be honest and serve the needs of the family, show respect, proper care, treat the deceased with dignity. And in speaking with morticians about this, they really, internalize these ideals and virtues of their profession. That, look, we are service providers. Our goal is to meet the needs, not only professional but also sort of emotional, financial needs as well, of the family of the deceased. That's our job. That's what we're supposed to do. And that creates this sense that morticians and funeral directors are sort of maybe not entirely a for-profit enterprise, but in fact they are. This isn't charity work, right? These aren't nonprofits. Like, these are for-profit organizations. So there's this odd kind of internal conflict in the profession itself, where on the one hand they have these sort of high character form the core of the profession, and there's this attitude of meeting the needs of the family. All other interests take a back seat to that, and that is somewhat in conflict with the idea of, like, look, you're in this for the profit. You're here to make money. This is not, this isn't charity. This isn't the Red Cross. We're here to make a buck. So you might think that in this VA cemetery case, the answer to whether or not the mortician and funeral director should bring this up is no, because let's just compare this to other kinds of commercial for-profit companies. We don't ask any of them to disclose more affordable alternatives to their potential customers, so we need some reason to think morticians are uniquely obligated to provide this kind of information. Now again, morticians and funeral directors think that they are obligated to do this, and I think it has something to do with the way they understand their role. What's sort of interesting about this, and what we should maybe ask ourselves when we think about sort of the end-of-life funeral industry, we should ask ourselves whether it really makes sense, given the way the role is defined, for this to be a strictly commercial for-profit enterprise. Because in some sense we're asking morticians and funeral directors to wear two hats that are completely in conflict with one another. One is this hat of the service provider, provide a service for the purpose of making a profit. And so that's what I just want to kind of leave you guys with as a final thought, is this idea that, look, we have this industry that has sprung up around end of life, sort of what to do with bodies, how to recognize, built on these sort of two poles that are completely opposed to one another. This one pole that says, take care of the family, meet their needs, whatever those needs may be, and this other pole that says, this is a business, we're here to make money, so let's go about doing that as best we can. Okay, so that's going to conclude our lecture for Module 5. Go ahead and take care of your last question for the lecture assignment, and then move on to finishing up what you have left on the discussion board and getting into the module assignment itself.